It's really my pleasure to be here and honor to address this group. So, I'll talk for about 40 or 45 minutes. And the paper that Henry uploaded to chat is actually a longer version, but it'll be virtually the same thing. Just I'll cut some things out as we go along, so you can read along if that's easier than listening. So he said the title is How to Reach the Absolute, Bergson's Anti-Kantianism. So I'll just begin. And I have a screen on my left, so I'll be looking to my left a lot. So anyways, here it goes. Leonard's career, his 1922 introduction to the creative mind. Bergson says, we have attributed to science as to metaphysics the power to reach the absolute. Even though Bergson is responding in this quotation to then contemporary critics of his philosophy, it is easy to see that this quotation refers to Kant. In fact, Bergson had just finished the prior section of the introduction by criticizing the critique of pure reason. And of course, we find criticisms of Kant throughout all of Bergson's writings and courses. Therefore, one would be justified in defining Bergson's thought as a kind of anti-Kantianism. As he says in the 1907 Creative Evolution, there is nothing that can be more contrary than my philosophy to the letter and perhaps also the spirit of the critique of pure reason. In Creative Evolution, we find the one claim that is the seed for all Bergson's criticisms of Kant. There is for Kant only one experience. In the critique of pure reason, as is well known, Kant argues that human knowledge is finite because experience, intuition, is limited to what is given in sensibility. According to Kant, humans have no access to any other sort of experience or intuition. We cannot intuit objects that are not considered as appearances. Intellectual intuition, Kant says, lies outside our faculty of cognition. In contrast to Kant, Bergson argues that we have more than one kind of experience. He argues that we have not intellectual intuition, but a supra-intellectual intuition. In the 1903 Introduction to Metaphysics, Bergson describes the supra-intellectual intuition as un sentiment, a feeling would be the usual English translation. The word sentiment indicates that supra-intellectual intuition is en sentir, a kind of sensing. Sensing distinguishes a supra-intellectual intuition from intellectual intuition, which is supposed to give us intellectual, non-sensible access to reality. Although the supra-intellectual intuition is experience, this sensing is not perception. Perception for Bergson looks at things from the outside, is concerned with matter, and it is practical. In contrast to perception, Bergsonian intuition is speculative. It looks at things from the inside, is kind of introspection, and it is spiritual or mental. The sensing or feeling, according to Bergson, is self-sympathy. As he says in the introduction to Metaphysics, with no other thing can we sympathize spiritually, but one thing is sure, we sympathize with ourselves. Now, if we are supposed to have, according to Bergson, the power to reach the absolute, then the question is obvious. How can we reach the absolute by sympathizing with ourselves? Isn't this intuition the most relative experience? My presentation today attempts to show this intuition is not relative, and Bergson is right when he claims that we can gain access to the absolute, or at least to a version of what we have traditionally called the absolute. I know that most philosophers today will react to this claim with skepticism. Perhaps, however, this reaction is due to the continuing influence of Kantianism itself, or to the persistent scientism Bergson denounces in The Creative Mind. Now, to see the plausibility of what Bergson claims for us, we must believe that not everything is known through physics. Unlike Kant, Bergson thinks that metaphysics is possible, where the sole object of physics is matter. Metaphysics' sole object of investigation is mind. In its investigation of mind, metaphysics shows us, according to Bergson, through different planes, or better, different tensions of our interior life. By contracting and relaxing the tension, we can, according to Bergson, move from the most intense to least intense. We can move from a creative act of freedom to the repetition of necessary connections. In other words, we can reach matter and we can make contact with spirit, which Bergson calls God. we're able to ascend above human experience and to descend below human experience. Therefore, we can reach at least something like the absolute. As Bergson says in Introduction to Metaphysics, this absolute is not a conceptual eternity, which is an eternity of death, but an eternity of life. However, I think what Bergson is referring to with the word absolute, this eternity of life, is a continuity of durations, with intuition allowing us to feel ourselves as one duration in a series of durations. Now, to reach the absolute, we'll start with the key to all Bergson's thinking, which is qualitative multiplicity. So I hope this is okay so far. It's okay. Okay, maybe this is well known to a lot of you, but it is so important to for understanding Bergson's thought that I'm going to go over it one more time. So as I was just referring to, the key term in Bergson's thought is la durée, duration, or time. So the immediate givens of consciousness are called duration. Now, Kant, of course, made time be the inner form of sensibility, but according to Bergson in his very first book, the 1889 Time and Free Will, Kant made an error by conceiving time as a homogeneous milieu. By conceiving time as a homogeneous milieu, Kant understood time to be a form prior to, a priori, and independent of its content. By understanding time as a form, according to Bergson, Kant reduced time to space, and therefore to geometry. Instead, for Bergson, again in Time and Free Will, duration is heterogeneous and inseparable from its content. Real duration, he says, is made up of moments inside one another, and when it seems to assume the form of a homogeneous whole is because it gets expressed in space. After Time and Free Will, in his 1893-1894 course on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Bergson says, Kant's analysis of our personality does not apply to the idea we draw from ourselves in a profound intuition. No matter what, criticism of Kantianism must make all of its efforts bear on this point. The criticism must bear on the point that our personality, or a person, and therefore our duration, is a qualitative multiplicity. Now here's the part that people usually know, but go through it again. Qualitative multiplicity is not a quantitative multiplicity. In Time and Free Will, Bergson describes a flock of sheep as a quantitative multiplicity. To constitute a quantitative multiplicity, which is always done out of practical or utilitarian interest, one ignores the content of the space the items occupy, which results in the space being homogeneous. In the case of the flock of sheep, one ignores the fact that the pasture in which they are feeding is beautiful, and the fact that the sheep are not strictly identical to one another. One focuses on what they have in common. What one is interested in is the total number of sheep, be it for meat or wool production. We're able to enumerate them because each sheep occupies a discernible location within the field because they are juxtaposed to one another. Of course, the enumeration of the sheep is represented by a symbol, by a number. Similarly, a calendar or clock is a homogeneous form of time. This formal measurement of time is what Bergson thinks Kant has in mind with the inner sense of time. In contrast, Bergson argues that we are able to turn ourselves away from all utilitarian interests. Time appears as a qualitative multiplicity in which the moments flow continuously into one another and are heterogeneous to one another. Now, as with quantitative multiplicity, Bergson gives us many examples of qualitative multiplicity. And this is more original with me, what I'm going to say now. But perhaps the most significant example is the feeling of pity, a moral feeling, not unakin to sympathy. As we saw above, Bergson defines intuition as sympathy. Here he calls sympathy a moral feeling. Our experience of sympathy or pity begins, according to Bergson, with us putting ourselves in the place of others and feeling their pain. But Bergson continues, if this were all, the feeling would inspire in us an abhorrence of others, and we want to avoid them, not help them. But then one realizes that if one does not help this suffering person, it's going to turn out that no one will come to my aid when I need help. there's a need to help the suffering. For Bergson, these first two phases are inferior forms of pity. In contrast, true pity is not so much fearing pain as desiring it. It is as if nature committed a great injustice. What we want is not to be seen as complicit with it. Bergson says, the essence of pity is thus a need for self-abasement, an aspiration downward into pain. But this downward aspiration develops into an upward movement into the feeling of being superior. One feels superior because one comes to realize that one can do without certain sensuous goods. In the end, however, one feels humility, humble, since one no longer needs and desires such sensuous goods. By denying ourselves of these goods, we in a way reestablish justice. Later in the 1932, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, Bergson shows that the feeling of pity or sympathy is in fact progresses to the point of love for all things. So to summarize a little bit, the feeling of sympathy is a qualitative progress. It consists in a transition from disgust to fear, from fear to sympathy, and from sympathy itself to humility. There is a heterogeneity of feelings here. Feelings are continuous with one another. They interpenetrate one another. There is even an opposition between inferior needs and superior humility. If we try to juxtapose the feelings, that is, separate them spatially, the feelings would have a different nature than when they interpenetrate. There would be no progress from one to the other. They'd be isolated psychic states. Therefore, Bergson, a qualitative multiplicity is heterogeneous or differentiated, continuous or unifying, oppositional or dualistic at the extremes, and most importantly, temporal or progressive in irreversible flow. Bergson also calls the last characteristic of temporal progress mobility. This characteristic truly distinguishes duration from space, which is an immobile milieu. As we shall see, the characteristic of mobility is important for how we reach the absolute. Finally, because the qualitative multiplicity is heterogeneous and yet interpenetrating, it is inexpressible. The continuous and heterogeneous multiplicity of consciousness is given immediately, that is, without the mediation of symbols. As Bergson famously says in Introduction to Metaphysics, metaphysics is the science that claims to do without symbols. Okay. And this brings me to my second section. Which is really on Kant, on knowledge and freedom. I'm going to focus on Bergson's 1904-1905 course on the evolution of the problem of freedom. And I've translated this into English. That's why I know it so well. It'll be forthcoming in Bloomington next year. But anyways, what I claim here is that this course contains Bergson's most extensive treatment of Kant. The theme of this course is the relation of necessity and contingency being required for freedom, according to Bergson, is called on the evolution of the idea of freedom. The first half of the course concerns ancient Greek philosophy from Homer to Plotinus, while the second half concerns modern philosophy from Descartes to Kant. Thus, in the first half, Bergson shows that in regard to knowledge, ancient Greek philosophers recognized regularities, but their mathematics was not advanced enough to discover the concept of natural laws. In regard to action, the ancient Greeks, according to Bergson, saw no positive value in it. Action's only value was to help us correct our material life and return to the realm of ideal forms. In contrast, the modernists had made advances in mathematics. They were then able to mathematize regularities and conceive natural laws. Similarly, the modernists, for Bergson, grant to action a positive value, making it something good in itself. While Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz made progress over the ancients, it is only Kant, according to Bergson, who brought to light the very quintessence of the modern conception of knowledge and the quintessence of the modern conception of action. So first, I'll talk about knowledge or science in Kant. The The starting point of the critique of pure reason, according to Bergson, again, as far as I can tell, Bergson really only knew the first critique. In the two sources, he refers to the second critique, but that's all it seems that he knows. So again, I mean, maybe what he's saying here is to be taken with a grain of salt, but I think what he says is interesting, worthy of consideration. So in any case, the starting point for the critique of pure reason is the failure of other modern philosophers, like Spinoza and Leibniz, to explain the success of modern science, to explain why mechanism works. Where earlier modern philosophers appeal to something outside of nature, God, to explain why mechanism works, Kant places the principle of nature within nature. Kant's great invention is that there is a hyphen between physics and mathematics, obviously physics dash mathematics. Like the hyphen, physics is linked to mathematics, forming a union. Kant shows that mathematical judgments are synthetic a priori judgments, just as judgments of nature are synthetic a priori judgments. Reasoning about numbers, magnitudes, and figures results in conclusions about objects, so mathematics for Kant are determinations in space and time. Then, as is well known, Kant makes the forms of space and time's determinations of our sensibility. Everything that is knowable for us must pass through this prism of space and time. Consequently, our mathematical knowledge is applicable to things perceived. Turning from the transcendental aesthetics to the transcendental logic, Bergson states that the categories of the understanding unify and systematize the material determined by the forms of space and time in our sensibility. By means of the category of causality, the understanding links phenomena to phenomena, objects to objects, resulting in absolute coherent and systematic unity of nature. Through this unity, science is able to have an unshakable confidence in itself. This systematic unity of nature is the quintessence of the modern conception of knowledge. But as Bergson says repeatedly in his writings, not just in this course, Kant's explanation for the success of science makes our knowledge relative. When Bergson, in the course on the evolution of freedom, turns to the question of action in Kant, he refers to the solution to the third antinomy in the critique of pure reason. Bergson claims that Kant does not assert the existence of human freedom, but he allows for its possibility. Freedom is possible because of the difference between the phenomenal world and the noumenal thing in itself. Freedom would be possible according to Bergson's reconstruction of Kant's philosophy, because freedom could lie behind the phenomena of nature. Given Kant's explanation of science, all of what appears to us is determined necessarily or mathematically. If I consider one of my actions, it takes place in space and time. Therefore, my action is explained by the events that preceded it, and that event was determined by the one that preceded it, and so on. However, as Bergson presents Kant's conception, if I consider all my actions from the beginning to the end, it is possible my actions were sent out into the phenomenal world unblocked. While the phenomenal world is causally determined, this freedom would be a different kind of causality. Freedom would be a causality sui generis, which consists in creating purely and simply the way we are. Since it precedes forms of space and time, this act of self-creation would be an atemporal act. While, as we'll see in a moment, Bergson objects to Kant's theory of freedom, he also says that consciousness tells us there is something true in this conception of freedom. Kant's conception of freedom has some truth to it because it corresponds to the idea that when I act freely, I create a new action. In short, the quintessence of the modern conception of action is creation. In fact, Bergson himself defines freedom as the creation of actions that are absolutely unforeseeable, of actions that add something to conditions on whose basis they are given. And now Bergson, I'm about halfway through right now, so Bergson has two principal objections to Kant's conception of freedom. The really big problem is, how can freedom so understood come to be inserted into the mechanism of nature without breaking nature's unity. As we just saw, for Bergson, Kant's conception of freedom is an atemporal act by means of which the intelligible self, not the empirical self, creates itself. This act then projects into time a series of actions or conducts, which are new facts introduced in the determinate necessary connections of nature. These facts, therefore, had to find a place within natural order. The act would have to find a gap in the connections or a place not occupied by necessary connections. However, since nature, for Kant, forms an absolute, unified, and consistent system, there is no empty place. Consequently, as Bergson says, this freedom is illusory. In other words, individual or personal freedom, the freedom of you or me, of someone who exists in nature, is not possible in Kant. Only an impersonal or general freedom is possible. The freedom of human consciousness in general, or no longer are there freedoms in the plural. There is only one freedom. This is the freedom of being in general. Bergson's objection means there must be contingency within nature, contingency appearing in nature, he argues, with all living beings. Bergson's second objection to Kant's conception of freedom is that Kant gives too much and too little to freedom. Kant, according to Bergson, grants too much to freedom insofar as he thinks that we absolutely and entirely create ourselves. This claim is too much, since we sense that there are obstacles to our action, and the nature of our character does not entirely come from ourselves. Our character comes about on the basis of certain psychological and hereditary conditions, and the opportunities or lack thereof shape our character as we mature. In short, we are not the complete authors of our character, as Kant's conception of freedom seems to imply. Kant grants too little to freedom, insofar as he thinks that once we choose our character in this atemporal choice, once we have chosen, as it were, a formula for our lives, every action seems to be given within this formula. However, for Bergson, for freedom is real and not illusory, then there has to be at least certain moments of our existence, absolute possibilities from which we choose, like the moment we encounter a fork in the road and have to choose which path to follow. In other words, to a large degree, for Bergson, we are subjected to our character, but there are certain moments when we can absolutely overturn our character. That brings me to the third part. I'm going to do a positive elaboration of Bergson's Anti-Kantianism. Now, as we saw, Bergson praises Kant for the inventive way he accounts for the success of natural sciences or physics. While prior modern philosophers had explained the success of science by appealing to God, Kant reduced their metaphysics to a minimum. Instead of God, the forms of the human understanding explain science's success. Even if the understanding in Kant is impersonal, even as the understanding, as Bergson says, as a humanity somewhat deified, the problem with Kant's account for Bergson is that he makes scientific knowledge relative to humanity. Even though Kant gives us reason to be confident in scientific knowledge, he still limits his knowledge to appearances. Reality, a thing in itself, eludes us. Bergson criticizes not only in Kant, but also the entire modern tradition of philosophy, the idea of a unified science, a thesis universalis. Bergson thinks the development of the social sciences and biology in the 19th century indicated splitting apart of the sciences. Biology and the social sciences use a different methodology than physics. I mean, obviously, from the viewpoint of the 21st century, this split never took place, right? For Bergson, physics deals with inert matter, while biology and the social sciences deal with life. Bergson's own explanation of the success of the natural sciences relies on the fact that, as Bergson has shown since the 1896 matter of memory, that human perception and intelligence, both being practical, are geared to action, and thus to the manipulation of matter, so that matter serves our needs. Bergson also argues, this is one of the main points of creative evolution, that as humans have evolved, so have their faculties, including intelligence. The evolution of intelligence leads to the natural sciences, which aim to make us masters of matter. Thus, we should have confidence in science, because if the intellect has been made in order to utilize matter, its structure has no doubt been modeled upon the structure of matter. In other words, intelligence adapted its abilities to utilize matter the best way it can. Intelligence knowledge of matter becomes more and more accurate. As it becomes more accurate, natural science for Bergson reaches, he says, one side of the absolute, which is matter. Again, as the quotation I started with, Bergson says we attribute to science, as to metaphysics, the power to reach the absolute. Now, as we also saw above or earlier, Kant preserves freedom in general, but not personal freedom. In Kant, as Bergson says, there are no freedoms in the plural. For Bergson, personal freedom is possible only if there's contingency in nature. As we said earlier, Bergson thinks that there's contingency in nature wherever there is life. However, his argument is really based on how he defines necessity. Following the Stoics, he defines necessity in a strict way as a truth whose negation is necessarily false. Necessity of that of which the contrary implies a contradiction. But as Leibniz saw, possible actions are not contradictory. Therefore, neither possible action is necessary. Bergson also argues that natural laws can be understood as statistical regularities under which there are irregularities. Our freedom then takes advantage of the irregularities and passes through the meshes of necessity. Finally, Bergson defines freedom as being the author of one's actions. But unlike Kant, Bergson does not grant too much to freedom. For Bergson, to be the author of one's actions is to feel that one's actions emerge naturally from the sensible intellectual states in which one finds oneself. In other words, to be the author of our actions is to sense that the actions emerge from the inclinations that we find ourselves with and from the decision that we make. Thus, even though the inclination is determined and the decision is determined, and even though the action that emerges from them naturally is determined, I am still the author of my actions. I am free because the action emerges from the elements, that is, my own inclinations, which constitute my will. My actions do not emerge from the inclination of others who might coerce me to act in a certain way. However, all of these arguments, so here's the list of them for Bergson, arguments for freedom. So his arguments for the strict definition of necessity, natural laws being defined as statistical regularities, and freedom defined as being the author of one's own actions. All of these arguments are really supported by the fact that the testimony of immediate consciousness shows us that we are free. In other words, by means of a supra-intellectual intuition, we know we are free. But also by means of the supra-intellectual intuition, we know that matter is spatial and therefore conceivable in terms of necessity. As we saw for Bergson, physics has matter for its specific object of investigation, one side of the absolute. In contrast, for Bergson, metaphysics has mind or spirit for its specific object of investigation. Unlike physics, which studies space, metaphysics studies time, that is duration. Now, despite this division of labor between physics and metaphysics, Bergson argues that through the investigation of duration, we come to see that matter in the entire universe is composed of durations. While physics allows us to see the real genesis of matter, metaphysics for Bergson allows us to see the ideal genesis of matter. Thus, metaphysics for Bergson makes contact not just with one side, but with the whole, the absolute. And this view of metaphysics leads us to the ultimate question of my presentation. How can we reach the absolute? What is this experience, the supra-intellectual intuition that Kant overlooked? Now, already I said, if I can add a little bit, that qualitative multiplicities are inexpressible in Bergson. But if you read enough Bergson, you know his writing is quite stimulating, primarily because of the images he produces. So, and the images are supposed to lead us to the intuition that generates his philosophy. So I'm going to focus on some images that he gives us. First, I'll look at the image of the inverted cone of memory, which is if you have the document open, I have a little reproduction of that image. Then these are less known images in Bergson. He describes the spring or coil of the will, and then the consciousness of the color orange. And these images will bring us, hopefully lead us to see how we reach the absolute. So this is really the punchline now, okay? So recall that the key to all of Bergson's thinking is the idea of a qualitative multiplicity, which is defined as continuous, heterogeneous, and moving. Despite it being a geometrical form, the inverted cone of memory, which is the first crucial image that I'm presenting for us to be able to reach the absolute, is continuous, heterogeneous, and in motion. Now, for those of you familiar with matter memory, I'm sure you can imagine the image, the inverted cone easily. Again, if you have the document open, I have a little reproduction of the cone there. So the horizontal lines in the cone represent periods or planes of the past. The inverted cone image is able to represent the movement of memory, because Bergson tells us the cone can rotate like a top, thereby bringing certain memories from the back to the front so they can descend from the base into the present, which is the apex. But memory also moves insofar as it contracts our personal memories into a point, which is the present action. And it relaxes our memories into an expanse as the cone broadens out, which is the past. Contraction is the effort of the will to bring the past to bear on the present. It is when we are most conscious, when we are most awake. The relaxation, in contrast, and recall that qualitative multiplicity is dualistic at the extremes. The relaxation is the lack of conscious effort, is when we are least conscious. The least conscious is what we experience in dreams and daydreams, where the images appear discontinuously. There seems to be no progress from one to the other, and therefore they seem to be nearly spatially separated. Thus, the movement of relaxation and contraction between the base and the apex of the cone represents for Bergson the movement from matter to mind. The cone image also shows us that Bergsonian intuition is not perception, which is, as we saw, always focused on the present. Intuition must be understood as an active memory, so we experience the continuous progress from the past to the present. Intuition must be a dilation, a widening, or even an opening of the mind to something other than the present. And if I can add a little bit, that part is actually to respond to Derrida's one criticism of Bergsonian intuition as being focused on the present. He never writes on Bergson to any length, but that one comment, I'm pretty sure he's wrong about that. Intuition is an active memory. But then let's go to the second image to show us how to reach the absolute. This image appears in Creative Evolution in the third chapter, which, if you know this book, third chapter is very strange and very hard to understand. But the image appears in the third chapter. So Bergson tells us, and this is one of the things I love about Bergson, he actually tells you what to do to have an intuition, which is really quite striking. So here he tells us in chapter 3 to make an effort to plunge back into pure duration. In the pure duration, the past is constantly swelling from all the new nows. But then he tells us that at the same time, we feel the spring, the French word I've reproduced, ressort, of our will winding itself tight to its utmost limit. We have to contract violently, he says violently, our personality upon itself So we gather up the past that is slipping away. Then we thrust our will, compact and undivided, into a present it will create by entering it. But then, Bergson tells us that we should relax the spring of our will. Once the relaxation is complete, we find neither memory nor will. At that moment of complete relaxation, we then get a glimpse of an existence made of nows that come forward one after another, one disappearing before the other appears. We no longer have duration. Instead, we have entered matter. Matter for Bergson is composed of discontinuous instants, like the discontinuous dreams we have when we are asleep. Being discontinuous, matter is spatial, not temporal or durational, and that spatial can be mathematized. But what is most important here is the image of the will, which is the height of mind or spirit. Bergson tells us to imagine our will as a spring or a coil. We're supposed to imagine that we are tightening the coil of our will to accumulate energy, and then we release the energy of the will in order to produce a free action in the present, an action that is new and creative. But like any like any spring or coil, the will does not have to be wound tight. The coil can be relaxed. See, so on the cone of memory image, the will can contract itself or relax itself. When it relaxes itself or lets itself go, the will dissipates into the rules of habit, which require the things to be separate. The movement is from pure mind to pure matter. Therefore, the movement from contraction to relaxation, or vice versa, is the very movement of the absolute. Here we should know that when we contract our will to its limit, when we tighten the spring of our will to the maximum energy it can possess, Bergson thinks that we reach to come into contact with God. Later in the two sources, Bergson identifies intuition with mystical experience. Now, Introduction to Metaphysics, and just to be disclosive about my own feelings about this, that image I find to be the most stimulating one in Bergson's entire writings, the idea of the coil or the spring. And Bergson's obsessed with the steam engine. It was a great invention in the 19th century. So his idea of machines is quite different from our idea of machines. So that's why springs and coils are the image, right? So here's the third crucial image. It comes from Introduction to Metaphysics. And this is the consciousness of the color orange. And again, this is a strange image, but I mean, you have to fall in love with this. It's so crazy. Bergson says that we plunge into our own duration. We might think that there is no other duration but our own, just as, he says, there might be no other color in the world than orange. But if we sympathize with orange from the inside, this is the hard to understand, hard to imagine part, so we're supposed to go inside the color orange, rather than perceiving it from the outside, then the consciousness of orange would feel itself, again, it's se sentir, a form of sensing, would feel itself or sense itself placed between red and yellow. The consciousness of orange would intuit or presenter, have a presentiment of a whole color spectrum through which the continuity going from red to yellow is prolonged. Similarly, that's the image, with the intuition of our own duration, mine alone, I have an intuition that I am in contact with the whole continuity of durations that we should try to follow, either downward into matter or upward into mind. This image shows us that Bergsonian intuition is not solipsistic. There are always other durations continuous with mind. As Bergson says, we would have a feeling, on sentiment again, of a certain well-defined tension whose very definiteness appears as a choice between an infinity of possible durations. And it should be noted here that Bergson seems to accept Plotinus' claim that the universe sympathizes with itself. Then, as with Plotinus, when we sympathize with ourselves, we sympathize with the entire universe, since we are part of the whole universe. Again, following Bergson's example, I'm just about done now. I'm going to provide a set of instructions. for actualizing our power to reach the absolute. Or, to put this more modestly, instructions for understanding ourselves as one tension among a series of other tensions. So here are the instructions. First of all, we must violently contract our personality on itself. In other words, we must make the most vigorous effort to turn back, away from our habits of thoughts, habits which are rooted in utilitarian interests and focused always on the present. Only if we can break through these cognitive habits will we be able to dilate our mind to intuit the continuous progress from the past to the present. In other words, we must force ourselves to remember our own evolution through different planes of the past. Therefore, the first thing you have to do is engage not in perception, but in memory. In short, the first thing you have to do is remember. Then second, while remembering, we must be as awake as possible. We must contract our will as tight as we can, must draw as much of the past as we can into the will. And to make this a little more concrete, what Bergson means is to bring all of our learning, all of our education, all of our experiences to bear on the will. So it isn't just like I remember random images of myself when I was a child, but actually what we're remembering is all the learning we've achieved. It says maximum accumulation of the past provides energy for the will, and of course what Bergson calls spiritual energy. Then release the energy into action, into a creation. When you collect and release energy into a creative act, then we become spiritualized, and Bergson would add, we come into contact with God. Now Bergson is clear that these two steps occur rarely. Just like the actual an act of freedom, usually in freedom, in our acts, we follow our habits. But here too, in this attempt to reach the absolute, we usually follow a habit and we don't get there. So these two steps occur rarely. It's a rare experience. Most of the time, we cannot break free of our utilitarian interests and our cognitive habits, which explains the skepticism about us being able to reach at least something like the absolute. But to continue with the instructions, third, stop drawing energy into the will. Instead, let yourself go. Let yourself daydream. As I said above, the different images that appear in a daydream are discontinuous and nearly spatialized, and therefore nearly materialized. But also by daydreaming, by almost falling asleep, you descend into your body, and then biochemical processes take over. Biochemical processes are, of course, bound to necessary natural laws. In other words, we descend into matter, we become material. By ascending into spirit and ascending into matter, we come to sympathize with the entire universe. We humans are one duration, one within a whole continuity of durations. Then if our duration is continuous with all the others, if we are not closed off, big transition at the end here, how can we not be moved to love all humans, all animals, and all things? The affirmation of unconditional love is the principal message of Bergson's last work, the two sources of morality and religion. But this allows us to understand why Bergson says in his first book, Time and Free Will, that sympathy is a moral feeling. So thank you.